Hello, it's Aaron Wren. Welcome back to the show. Today, my special guest is Delano Squires. He is a research fellow in life, religion, and family at the Heritage Foundation, and he's also a contributor to The Blaze. I met him a couple of years ago when we both spoke at a conference together. And it's just great, and his material is great. He's a very thoughtful person, which is not what you usually see in people talking about gender issues, family issues, etc. So I'm very delighted to have him with me today from the Heritage Foundation studios in Washington, D.C. So thank you, Delano, for coming.
Thank you for having me.
We hear a lot today about the problems facing boys and men. So they're falling behind educationally. There's prime working age men who aren't in the labor force, aren't in school, proverbially sitting in mom's basement, playing video games. We have all these deaths of despair. Richard Reeves, formerly the Brookings Institution, has built an entire organization around kind of these problems. How did we end up in this situation?
I think, excuse me, a couple different things going on, and I'm glad you brought up Richard Reeves because I would definitely like to circle back to his ideas on this topic. But I think a big part of it is that for 60 plus years, men have been named as society's primary enemy, and obviously you can intersectionalize that in many ways, right? But just for decades, we've been told that men are a problem. Men cause all the wars, they cause all the problems, they're abusive, they're toxic, they're controlling, they're domineering, they want to subjugate women and all other oppressed groups. And I think what we've seen is that, there's been a movement, obviously the post second wave movement, second wave feminist movement and beyond has been very explicit in its desire to unseat men from what it believed was men's, position of power and privilege. And in doing so, we went from fighting sexism to fighting masculinity. Now, the feminists would deny that they're doing that, but it's incredibly difficult to say, we want to take men down a notch, but we really still care about them at the same time. So I think what you've seen happen in subsequent decades is that many of the issues that men have always had, right, whether it's issues of isolation or men who feel overworked and don't necessarily have people to talk to and community, have just been exacerbated because all of the emphasis has been on the girls, making sure the girls are okay, making sure the girls are getting the education that they need, making sure the girls are getting the medical attention, the mental health interventions that they need, as the boys have been languishing. Because when you believe that someone has power and privilege, the last thing you concern yourself with is their sort of social, economic, or emotional condition, because doing so would be an act of betrayal to the marginalized and the oppressed. So I think in many respects, boys have continued to fall behind because there's not really a market for people advocating on their behalf. And I think that's starting to change now, which is a good thing. But as I said, even some of the stuff with Richard Reeves, I understand the positions he's taking. I definitely sense his deep desire to see men and boys, their lives improve. But I feel ultimately it is ceding much of the ground to feminists on some of the core issues facing boys and men, particularly issues around marriage and family.
So you say there's like some of these signals perhaps that men are getting or people aren't concerned with them, but isn't there a sense in which you can't allow that to keep you from succeeding in your life anyway? It does seem like a lot of men out there are responding in bad ways, and aren't necessarily doing what they should do. Is there any kind of validity to that critique? That men need to, you hear this in church a lot, men need to man up. The solution is to man up. If you were doing what you should be doing, then you wouldn't have any problems.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And let me be crystal clear. I'm not blaming the condition of men on women, because the last thing men need to do is to become another victim group and look for someone outside of themselves to blame. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that in a similar sense to the historical um, issues around the Tuskegee experiment, right? When
Mm-hmm.
people think of Tuskegee experiment, they think um, crooked scientists giving poor black men bad medicine.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, what it was is that scientists were refusing to address the condition, the health conditions of black men for decades, and allowed them to just languish in pain and suffering. And I think something similar is happening with men in terms of people not wanting to address the conditions. But yes, I think in many respects, men need to man up. I think that there is a sense in which we as a group have taken on, our own sense of victimhood, which I don't think is helpful. I think many boys are not learning what it means to be a man because more than ever before, boys are being raised apart from their fathers. Right, 25% of children in America are raised by a single parent, typically a single mom. That is by far the highest rate in the world. 40% of children in America are born out of wedlock. So that doesn't mean that they're fatherless per se, but it means that they're starting life with a mom and a dad who don't have as secure a relationship with one another as they could. And I think many of these things contribute to some of the issues that young boys face, issues of feeling disconnected, disaffected, isolated. This is, in some respects, this is a connection conundrum because we are more connected to one another by technology than ever before. But you see studies that show people feeling less connected to people in real life, right? Less community, fewer groups for men, fewer all men's bowling leagues and that type of thing. So yeah, I think it's a number of different factors. Obviously, there are economic factors at play. Men need to feel as if we're being useful and productive with our hands in the economy and industry, and particularly if we're supporting a family. But yeah, there are a number of issues sort of pulling and pushing on men. But I think one of the big ones is that, um, again, when you're seen as privileged, no one really cares that much about you.
How big a role is, you mentioned fatherlessness, men growing up, if not fatherless, completely, but without, being a married dad in the home. How big a role does that play? Because it seems like there really is like a lot of correlation of social dysfunction with fatherlessness and broken homes. And then there's so many of these kids don't have young boys. They're raised by single mothers, or they're raised primarily by a mom. Their teachers at school are all women. There's no male role models in their life. They don't get to see any of that. It seems like it'd be very, very difficult to come up with an idea of what it means to be a man
Hmm.
if you don't actually have one with you in your life, and all you're looking at is like male figures on TV or on the ball field or whatever that don't represent like a fully formed human being.
Yeah, I do. I think a huge part of it is the absence of fathers. Um, a dad gives a young girl, an ideal of what a good father gives a young girl what an ideal mate would look like, right? So a model for a future mate. But he gives a son a pattern to be a future man. And when young boys don't have that pattern, they seek it in other places. Now, the interesting thing is that sometimes people on the left will dismiss the importance of fathers as long as there are other intervening institutions, as long as there are government programs that keep, you know, women and their children out of poverty, as long as there are, after school programs and education programs. But it's so interesting that one of the things that, people will look to when it comes to this is sports. They'll say, oh, we got, sports gives kids an outlet, but it also, coaches can play the role of father. But if having a dad wasn't important, then why would the coach need to fill that role? Right. So
Mm-hmm.
I think having a father in the home, and it's not necessarily because every man is going to do the things that we read as like specifically male, like male coded, right? Every guy does not know how to fish. They don't all hunt. They don't all know how to throw a perfect spiral. Some may not be particularly good on the grill.
You're describing
But
me in all those cases.
but there's something about presence.
Yeah.
I remember this was probably about 15 years ago. I was still in New York in my parents' house, and I remember just looking out of the window, or I might have been a teenager, and I was looking out of the window as my dad was walking up to the house, to come home. He was coming home from work. And I don't know why it struck me. It was just like my father's always been there. And there's something about presence, that everyday presence, that is reassuring, I think, to a family, to a wife, and to children. It's not sexy, it's not spectacular, but one of the highest compliments that any man could pay me is to say that I'm solid. Right.
Hmm.
And I think it's a high compliment to any man is to say, no, you're solid. And I think sometimes in a society where we have gotten used to drama in every area of our life, in our politics and our social lives, certainly in our entertainment, the people who are solid and stable and predictable and dependable are seen as being boring.
Mm.
But oftentimes, what we all need, and certainly what children need in their lives and in their formative years, is structure and stability. That's one of the reasons I appreciate my father so much, because he wasn't, he wasn't trying to be Superman, but
Hmm.
just his very presence in our home, my entire life, is something that I benefited from and try to replicate in my own home with my wife and my children.
Hmm. One of the places that men are turning for the role models, or maybe the fathers they didn't have, or be like the manosphere, or these online men's influencers. And, there's Jordan Peterson, there's Joe Rogan, there's Andrew Tate. There's a wide spectrum of these people. And there's so many of them that I've never heard of. I'm constantly coming across somebody I'd never heard before. He's got a YouTube channel and he has hundreds of thousands of views on his YouTube. What do you think are like the pros and cons of that online men's movement?
Well, I think one of the big cons is that you're talking about men having to reach out through the internet to connect with someone, right? And find someone to play the role that, again, a father, an uncle, a grandfather would have played. I think that that's indicative of, how far we've fallen as a society to some respects. I certainly think that men who listen to Jordan Peterson and hear, hey, you need to clean your room, need to stop blaming people, stand up straight, clean up your own house. I think that's a positive message, because I just want to be crystal clear. I am not one of these therapeutic guys. Like, I didn't grow up
Mm.
in that generation, and if I had to choose for my two sons, whether if I had to choose between a personality type that is more stoic,
Mm.
like my father, and my grandfather, and my great grandfather, or more, this is a professional podcast, more moist.
Yeah.
That's how I like to say it. That's an easy choice to me, right? I don't want to raise sons where every slight disappointment is a catastrophe, and they need a comfort animal, and they need, six hugs and three kisses. I don't want to raise those types of children. I don't want to raise the type of children, young people that I saw being written about after the 2016 election, where college campuses were giving students coloring books and allowing them, an opportunity, with comfort animals. I don't want to raise those types of boys. That being said, I think, again, finding positive male role models and mentors is a good thing. Men having connections with men and older, both older and younger, depending on your age, right? Where you can look to older generations for wisdom and for a pattern to follow. I don't think it's very good to get that entirely online. And as I said, I think Jordan Peterson fills one lane, Joe Rogan, right? The guys who say, hey, eat a lot of protein, exercise, get some sunlight. I'm all for that. I'm not against any of those things. I think where it gets really dark is where you get into that side of the internet and the manosphere, where sort of red pill influencers are telling men that if you really want to be a man, you get a vasectomy in your 20s, you work, right? Build up as much wealth as possible, you put off marriage, right? All of those things I think are dangerous messages, and I think it can get even worse, obviously, with the Andrew Tates of the world. So I think men need to be discerning and wise in terms of where they go for their formation, and I definitely believe this is an area where the local church should be playing more of a role, because men are not being formed according to the types of biblical and Christian values that will allow them to be solid enough, right, to sort of hold up a wife and children and a family. And in fact, what I'm seeing is what I call the masculine critique from the right that mirrors the feminine mystique from the left. So in some respects, Andrew Tate is really not that far off from your radical pink-haired septum ring, feminist studies professor. Both are telling their respective troops, um, tradition is a loser's game. Marriage is a loser's game. Women have more power than ever. Um, it does not benefit you to settle down, get married, have a family. And really, what you should do is pursue your individual interests and not think long term in terms of the family that you build today, and how what you build today will be built on by your offspring in the future.
Yeah, there really is a sort of hard edged anti marriage, anti woman edge, I think, that's really creeped into some of that. That wasn't there like a decade ago. I think the early manosphere, some of it was a little more, it was fun, it was edgy, it wasn't moral, a lot of it. It was the pickup artists and that, but
Hmm.
they seem to actually like women. Now there really is this sort of like anti woman edge and like anti marriage edge. And I don't think people understand, like, if you go down that path, where's that going to leave you when you're 50,
Mm.
or something like that, because you're building nothing, at the end of the day. And, with Jordan Peterson, you say like the stuff, clean your room, stand up straight. It really struck me when I read his stuff. Man, he's telling you the sort of thing your dad would have told you, your uncle. Like, this is like the most basic stuff of all time. But he
Mm.
sounds like a prophet
Mm.
to men that have nothing. And one of the things that you just hit that I want to just follow up on, because I'd like to hear you expand on it, is this idea of stoicism and not falling apart in the least bit of adversity. Because one thing I notice, and this seems to be like especially among like teenage or middle school girls, they get it really causes a lot of anxiety because everybody's putting on an act online. It's everybody's life looks perfect.
Mm.
Here's my day at the office, and here's these things. And everybody, the men's are online influencers are the same. They're all the macho alpha male successes. They're putting up an image. And what you don't get is like when you're growing up with like a dad and he experiences adversity, maybe he gets laid off from a job, you really get to watch like how you respond to adversity in your life. Because everybody's going to have some. And if you have like an older male role model who has something bad happen, you see him handle it in a good way, or at least not a horrible way. That's like a powerful message. I mean, how important is it to actually just watch some, older men going through stuff?
I mean, I actually watched my dad, deal with unemployment at one point in my teenage years, and exactly what you said, right? He didn't. I never got the sense that he definitely didn't freak out about it, right? I didn't even get the sense that it was keeping him up at night. Now it might have been, but I didn't get that sense. And I think part of what a father's role is to shield, right? Oftentimes we think of man protecting his family in sort of in an offensive manner, right? Somebody breaks into your home and you neutralize the threat. But part of it is to shield them from the types of worries and anxieties that just are natural in life. And I do think I benefited tremendously from seeing him go through some of those difficult times. And, as the British say, keep a stiff upper lip, never complained about it. Didn't whine about it, didn't talk about how terrible the world is or how unfair it was. He just kept looking for jobs, kept chipping away at it, and eventually, found something else. So I do think it's important, and I think again one of the problems that I have in terms of my critiques of the society's treatment of men, is this notion that men are better people, more whole, more sophisticated, more developed, more evolved when they behave more like women.
Mm.
And in some respects, I know on the conservative side, we hear about drag queen story hour, drag queens in schools, drag shows for kids. But really, I would argue that the most successful drag show and performance of the last 60 years actually has been the second wave feminist movement, because it told women that the height of femininity is thinking, speaking, and behaving like a man. And eventually, it began to tell men that you become more evolved when you behave more like a woman. And this is why I think there's some tension, between the sexes, and certainly it creates, tremendous mismatches in the dating market, um, because the alpha female thinks, speaks, and dresses like a man. She's got the power suit and the power pose and all this other stuff. And meanwhile, guys are being told, oh, you should cry more, express your emotions more. You should go to therapy. And I'm not against counseling, and certainly not against biblical counseling. Um, but if I'm at an event, a black tie event, and someone walking into the event who doesn't know me mistakes me for a server, right? Let's say I picked up a dish and the person mistakes me for a server. That's not a reason for me to have to go to a therapist and sit for an hour and talk about how hard it is being a black man in America, and I still get mistaken for the help. But I think society conditions men to engage in this sort of feigned helplessness, where it's, oh no, look at how bad we have things. And again, there's some guys who I certainly would say need counseling and would benefit from it. Um, but I think we just live in a much more therapeutic society that believes everything that we don't like, every disappointment, right, has to be addressed in this way. And I don't think that's particularly healthy. Aaron, it reminds me a little bit of when I was in the hospital with my wife with our firstborn, and after she had the baby, and the nurse would come around and ask her how she felt, and there was a pain scale, right? I think there's something we need something analogous to that in terms of our language around not just men, but generally speaking, around our feelings, because a disappointment is not an atrocity, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've seen people who've written this way, right? And I think there's a tendency to reach for the most extreme term to express the most sort of extreme emotions, and I don't see that as a particular masculine trait. I think part of being a man is being measured, being resolute, being able to, the ability to bear up under pressure. Those are the types of things that I look for, the types of things that I try to impart in my sons, because I know, Lord willing, the women who they would want to marry are going to look for those traits in them. And I
Mm-hmm.
tell my wife all the time when I'm driving, it's fine if you freak out. You'll know we're in trouble when I start freaking out on the road.
Mm.
So that's why I try to, instill that in them, even though they're only 6 and 4 years old.
Now, so you're a believer. It sounds like you're a believer in traditional masculinity.
Yes, yes. But here's where I think, um, I'm certainly a believer in traditional masculinity, but I would also acknowledge I'm probably more modern in my everyday life than my father and my grandfather. If my granddad changed any of my dad or his five other siblings, if he changed any of their diapers, their nappies, as they
Mm-hmm.
would have been called back then, I probably would be surprised by that. I highly doubt he ever wore one of the kids in a baby Bjorn,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, in some respects, I think um, there's a lot more wiggle room for men when it comes to, how we can express ourselves today than there was, 60 years ago. And I think some of that is positive. I think men having closer emotional connections with their children, particularly in today's age, is a positive thing. But like all good things, I think there can be an overcorrection. And I'm a type of person that I'm fine. I'm not just fine with. I welcome the fact that there is less elasticity, culturally speaking, when it comes to the baseline for what makes a good man. So for men, at the very least, it's going to be two things: you have to provide and you have to protect. It doesn't
Mm.
matter how good you look, how much money you make. If you're a man and you don't do those two things, society will call you a louse. They'll call you, a deadbeat, a bum, all types of, nasty terms. For women is far more elasticity, and in fact, society resists the compulsion to say that a good woman must do these two things.
Mhm.
Right? We resist that, even if it's support and nourish. Well, are you trying to say that women who don't support their husband are not? So there's far more elasticity, culturally speaking, cultural elasticity when it comes to the roles of women, and I'm fine with having, um, the fact that men are still sort of grounded in those two pillars, and I hope we don't see ripping those things up from the roots as a sign of progress.
Yeah, you make a great point there. Is it's not necessarily about being exactly like your grandfather was, because their generations had their own issues,
Hmm.
and we're today like you. I mean, I like being engaged as a father in my son's life in ways that I think just wasn't the norm in the past. You mentioned being at the hospital, like being in the delivery room. Nobody in my parents' generation was in the
No,
delivery room when their wife had a kid. They probably wouldn't have even let you in there.
right.
But so I'm curious, like you like the traditional masculinity, but with the update, looking at this situation today, and knowing that every man is going to be different in terms of who they are, what their circumstances are. What not the Andrew Tate script. We don't want that. What kind of a script or like a path would you encourage young men today to be aspiring towards in the world we live in?
Mm. I think ultimately this goes back to a matter of worldview, and I think masculinity, that is free flowing and not tethered to something solid, is bound to fail. And this is why, as a Christian, like I look to the scriptures to sort of define what a good man is, and some of those definitions are ones that I can gather from specific examples of characters, and then others are like the fruit of the spirit. I think a good man is patient, is kind, um, is tough, right? Is gentle. Like it's like the perfect. It's like leather, like a leather belt, perfect combination of tough and tender. And having the wisdom and discernment to know when to apply both. I think a good man is willing to protect the people and the things that he loves. I think a good man looks downrange and thinks not just about himself, but his children, his grandchildren. The scriptures say that a good man leaves an inheritance for his children and his children's children. So I think the scriptures actually give a very solid template of what it means to be a good man, right? I think of Ephesians 5 and the types of things that husbands are called to do, which goes further than just protect and provide. It's about spiritually nourishing your wife. And to the extent that Christian men will sort of lean on Titus 2 and say, we need more Titus 2 women, I would answer, well, I believe Titus 2 wives need Ephesians 5 husbands, right? Who are willing to love them the way Christ loves the church. That's a radical sort of type of love, right? A self, it's not a self-serving type of love. It's being willing to lay down your life, for your wife and for your family. So I see that as a template. Um, it's interesting because given where we are today as a society, I tend to lean into more the traditional sort of masculine roles because I know everything that young men are encountering in the culture is telling them to be soft. I literally see hashtags about men living the soft life, which is typically just guys on TikTok, showing themselves cooking dinner and lighting a candle and
Hmm.
buying themselves flowers. I mean, it's not. Before I got married, I slept on the floor for 5 years, and I didn't had an apartment with no furniture, so it's not how I would have lived. But I think these messages are being pushed at men, and I think There's a need for guys to stay grounded in what it means to be a man, because we're losing it. You made a point about Jordan Peterson and what it says about a society, when him saying the most simple and basic things, clean your room, stand up straight, is treated as some sort of prophetic wisdom. I think we're in a similar space when it comes to, uh, you know, advice to men and women, because we've become a society that can't even define those terms, right? We've become disembodied people. It's just all about what I believe and my personal experience and how I feel, and I don't want men to get swept up in that. So um, I definitely would say my template for what it means to be a good man, a good husband, a good father, comes directly from Scripture.
It sounds like in that you're very much a supporter of men being intentional about building a legacy through getting married and having children and grandchildren.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I've said, responded to one red pill influencer who said, get a vasectomy, stack your money, work hard, stay off the drugs, stay off the porn. I'm cool with those messages. But I said, uh, a man, a king, how did I put it? A king with no heirs is just a guy living in a big house, right?
Hmm.
So at a certain point, and that's not to say every man will have children. There are issues that may complicate that, right? It is to say that I believe that family should be a priority for men. But again, we live in a careerist society that says focus on your career first and then fit in family wherever you can, as opposed to previous generations lived in a family society where we say, okay, you focus on your family first, and then you find a job that allows you to provide for them. Those are two very different, orientations, because they have two different, sets of priorities. So yes, I am very much in favor of, men sort of seeing their legacy primarily in their posterity, so that years from now, when we're long gone, our five times great grandchildren can talk about how much they benefited from what the foundations that we built, in this particular generation.
Yeah. Again, you kind of get at something there that people are afraid to talk about kind of normative past. They're afraid to say, men should get married and have kids because there's always an exception. Or what about people who couldn't have kids for some reason? And so I think because we don't want to make anybody feel bad or any of that, we don't talk about the norm in the interest of the exceptions, rather than saying like, here's the norm, and yeah, there are exceptions. Maybe that's not you for whatever reason. And or maybe it's not you and you wanted it, and that hurts. It does hurt. It's one
Right.
of life's disappointments. But I think we're afraid a lot of times to just say things like that, because I think it was like, oh, we can't be hurting anybody's feelings.
The the irony of that, and obviously, we're in election season. I've written a few columns on the left's attempts to reach men generally and their trouble with reaching black men in particular. And I see how easily they find it to lecture black men publicly for not being as enthusiastic about a Kamala Harris presidency as they think that they should. And I find it ironic, because I'm in the process of finishing a manuscript for a book on marriage and the black family. I find it ironic that there are people who have no problem with norms, with using the word should, with social expectations when it comes to supporting a particular political party.
Hmm.
Now, if I turn that around and say, hey, I want to use that same infrastructure, the cultural infrastructure used to police behavior, right? Making shame biblical again, let's put it that way. I want to use that to help rebuild, marriage and the black family. People say, no, you can't do that. You can't make people feel bad about their decisions. But again, when it comes to politics, there's the left sees 90% support of the Democratic Party as a sign of cultural health and solidarity. But for some reason, the moment we begin to speak in normative terms, or in terms of expectations, or in terms of shoulds, or in terms of ideals, when it comes to either sex roles or family or any of those sort of related social issues, then all of a sudden people start to make exceptions. So I know people, tend to do that, and they say, well, you're going to make people feel bad about things that are outside of their control, or things that are in their control, that they have different priorities. But I find that progressives have no problem wielding that shame cudgel when it benefits them politically.
No, that's right. There's no doubt about that. I want to turn to you. Already just actually started in on this topic of, we talked about what to do as a man, as a person, but how we should be thinking about social changes and social remedies to some of these challenges. And you mentioned Richard Reeves earlier. He wrote the book of Boys and Men, and he had some prescriptions. You seem eager to engage with Reach. I'd love to hear your take on Richard Reeves' prescriptions for society.
So let me for the sake of not appearing to want to beat up on Richard Reeves. Not that I could. I mean, he's a published author and a scholar in his own right. But I think people like Richard Reeves or Melissa Kearney, who I'm sure you're familiar with her book,
Yeah.
Two Parent Privilege, I think their heart is in the right place. Um, my assessment is that the center left scholars and intellectuals, I believe, again, they want the right things. I just don't think they have the worldview that gets them from where we are today to where they want to be. I'll give you an example. So again, I'm writing a book on marriage and the black family. So first half of the book is on the things that I argue destroyed the black family. So I start with slavery. My second chapter is on sort of big government liberalism. And at one point, I was reading through the Moynihan report. Daniel Patrick Moynihan obviously wrote a report on the state of the black family. And in one section, he said something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing. He talked about the matriarchal nature of the black family, even in 1965. And he said, um, while there's no sort of requirement that families be father led, in a society where the majority population has families that are led by a husband and a father, any group that has something opposite is going to be at a disadvantage. And again, I read that, and I stopped and I said, man, for all of Moynihan's sort of policy chops, that is a glaring hole in his worldview. Because what he's arguing is that, if I could use the term, a more patriarchal family structure um, has no sort of inherent value, or is more of a social construct, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And that, it's quite, as it's possible that, why couldn't we have matriarchal families? Oh, the reason we don't is because either government policy doesn't allow it or social norms don't allow it. And I'm saying, no, this is a design feature. And I think, coming back to Kearney and Reeves, from the things that I've heard from them, uh, they are reluctant to criticize, again, anything having to do with, again, second wave feminism. And I'm not criticizing women per se. I'm criticizing the ideology that tells women that femininity is weak, masculinity is toxic, marriage is oppressive, the home is a prison, and children are a burden. And I think that sort of sums up a significant part of what second, third, fourth wave feminists have been pushing. So these scholars will say, well, no, all of those changes in society for women were good and positive. But yet we see a need for more married couples, more two parent homes, tradition, right? If I could use that term. But I don't think that they understand how doubling down on what we've been doing, and this is probably more so on Melissa Kearney's side than Richard Reeves' side, doubling down on social programs for social welfare programs for low income moms and their children only further exacerbates the problem that we already have. I've heard Reeves debate Ian Rowe, of AEI, and running charter schools in the South Bronx. And Ian was taking the position that marriage matters, particularly as it relates to fathers and their children. And Richard Reeves was taking a position, well, I think we can address fatherhood apart from marriage. And I'm saying, no, we can't. On an individual basis, maybe, but on a societal basis, a move towards conscious co-parenting, as one political commentator put it, um, is a move in the wrong direction, because I would argue at least 50% of a man's relationship with his children is dependent on his relationship with their mother. And when you break that apart, when you break the bonds between husband and wife, between man and woman, you will always have some downstream effect on the children. There's a reason that in sickness and health, and for richer for poorer, till death do us part, is nowhere to be found in any divorce decree, child support order, or co-parenting agreement that I've ever heard of. Right. So I think we need to get back to re-embodying, if I can use that term, the family unit, to say one man, one woman committed to one another for one lifetime, and committed to the fruit that come from that union. And I think that that's a message that can be difficult for some people on the center left to articulate.
You mentioned you're writing a book about the Black family. So I want to kind of wrap up by just asking you a couple questions about that theme. Most of my audience, are kind of white conservatives, many of them religious. What are the biggest misconceptions about the Black family? Or, what are some myths that, you could like set us straight on?
Well, I can let me start today, and then I'll work my way backwards in time. I think one of the biggest myths today is that I've seen this number: 75%, 85% of Black children are fatherless. I think that's a myth because it's just terribly imprecise, right? 70% of Black children are born to unmarried parents. And that in and of itself is a sign of um, significant issues in terms of, socially and culturally. But because a man and woman are not married does not mean that a child is fatherless. I can tell you just from my own observations, when we lived in DC, in a working class neighborhood, 35% of the pickups and drop offs at daycare and in my daughter's charter school were dads. Now, these are also kids who tended to be young. And what the research shows is that as children age, non-resident fathers there just tends to be some distance that comes with that. So they're less likely to play with, eat with, speak to, bathe, read books to their children every day as those kids get older. So I think we should speak with precision when it comes to these issues, right? Because a father can still be involved in the life of his child even if he doesn't live with that child. That being said, I think it's ideal when father, mother, and children are under the same roof, going back to what we were saying earlier in terms of the presence. So I think that's one myth. Another one, and I deal with this early in the book, is that slavery destroyed the Black family. Now, what I say in the book is that slavery, in many respects, particularly in this country, in some respects, defined the Black family, because you have people who were transported from Africa from many, many different tribes, who become amalgamated into a group and labeled Black or Negro at the time,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this is no longer a man and a woman from a particular tribe in Angola or Benin or Nigeria. So in many ways, it defines the Black family. It certainly deforms the Black family, because the institution of slavery and institution of marriage are two irreconcilable institutions. Marriage comes with the presumption that of cohabitation, so husband and wife under one roof, of monogamy and sexual exclusivity, of the husband's ability to protect and provide for his wife and children. And slavery makes all of those things impossible. So as a husband, you couldn't guarantee to your wife that she will be with you tomorrow, because a slave owner could just sell you all apart, sell you to a different plantation 700 miles away, and you couldn't do anything about it. So it certainly disrupted the Black family dynamic. It deformed it. It didn't destroy it. And the reason I say that is because one of the first things you see after emancipation is men and women starting to put those family units back together. There's a series of ads that have been digitized in a project called Last Seen, which is out of Villanova University. And you can read ads of men looking for wives, women looking for husbands, willing to travel hundreds of miles to reconnect. And in 2 generations after, or 3 generations after in slavery, by 1940, only about 83% of Black children are born to married parents. By the time you get to 1965, it was 75%, so it dipped a little bit. That was considered a national emergency, 1 out of 4 out of wedlock birth rate. By the time you get to the mid 80s, it crosses 50%. And by the time you get to the early to mid 90s, it peaks at 72%. And it's been at or around 70% for the last 25 plus years. So I would say, again, the myth that slavery destroyed the Black family is one that's fairly pervasive. And I counter that not because of sort of my own right-leaning ideology, but just because I see how these forces, sort of interplay. I talk about 6 forces that actually did destroy the Black family. You have your big government paternalists who believe that Uncle Sam is a suitable husband and father for millions of low-income women. You have your feminists, who I mentioned before, right? You have your abortionists dedicated to the destruction of the child. You have your LGBT activists who have been pushing to redefine first marriage and then man and woman, both in law and social custom. You have your functional atheists. This is where I critique a subset of the Black church, the more liberation-minded subset of the Black church that traded biblical fidelity, particularly on this issue, for social justice. And then you have your anti-racists, which are your Black leaders who have allowed this issue to fester and metastasize because they believe that the key to solving all of Black folks' problems is either bigger government or better white people. So these 6 groups, who I call the Sinister Six, I do argue destroyed the Black family by the traditional Black family structure, by defying God, displacing the man, deceiving the woman, destabilizing marriage, devastating children, and then dividing the home. So that is sort of the central theme of the book, and I obviously unpack that. The benefit, this is not just a book about complaining and pointing out problems. The second half of the book is how we rebuild that family structure and what that looks like moving forward into the next 2 to 3 generations.
Well, once that book comes out, I'll have to get you back on here to promote the book and talk about it. It sounds fascinating. Yeah, a lot of people don't know. You go back to the mid-century era, the Black out of wedlock birth rate was far lower than the white out of wedlock birth rate today. Right. It's something else. And then I saw you post those ads on Twitter, images of those ads, and it is really remarkable. If you haven't seen them, you should go look them up. It's after slavery is over. People who were separated from their husband or their wife are running newspaper ads, like missing person ads, trying to find that person and reconnect with them. It's a very powerful part of our history to see those. And it's a part of the experience that until I saw you tweet them, I'd never heard of them. So thanks for bringing that up today. And again, thank you so much for joining me. Again, my guest today has been Delano Squires. He's a research fellow in life, religion, and family at the Heritage Foundation and a contributor to The Blaze. Delano, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.